I'd always found peace in the woods. They gave me an escape from the noise of everyday life. So when I came across a new trail recommendation in an online hiking forum, it immediately caught my interest. The trail was a loop deep in the Catskill Mountains, long, remote, and lightly trafficked. Sounded perfect. The post mentioned that the trail hadn't been maintained in years, but that only added to its charm for me. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, a week's worth of food, extra water, and a first aid kit. My hiking boots had seen better days, but they were broken in and comfortable, so I decided to take them along for one last trip. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the last stretch on a bumpy dirt road winding through thick forest. The parking area was nothing more than a grassy clearing, and mine was the only car there. I checked my phone, no signal. Not surprising. I locked up, tightened my pack straps, and set off. The first few miles were easygoing. The trail was overgrown but still visible, and I enjoyed the solitude. A light drizzle fell in the early afternoon, cooling the air. By the time I reached a small clearing to set up camp for the night, the rain had stopped, and a mist hung low over the trees. It was picturesque, the kind of scene that makes you pause and just take it in. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard the forest come alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional snap of a branch broke through the quiet. I always told myself that most sounds in the woods were animals or the wind, but there was an edge to being so isolated that heightened my senses. Still, I eventually fell asleep. The second day was harder. The trail became less defined, and I found myself relying on landmarks rather than the path itself. I had to stop often to check my map and compass. The terrain grew steeper, the undergrowth thicker. At one point, I slipped on loose rocks and landed hard on my side. My ribs ached, but nothing seemed broken. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. The sun was setting, and I hadn't seen another person all day. That's when I noticed something odd. A pile of stones arranged in a neat circle by the side of the trail. They were too deliberate to be natural. At first, I thought it might be a cairn marking the trail, but there were no others nearby. It was just there, isolated. I moved on, chalking it up to an old marker someone had forgotten to dismantle. But as I walked, I couldn't shake a growing unease. The forest felt different. The air was heavier, the sounds muted. I set up camp earlier than usual, feeling a need to stay put. That night, I woke up suddenly. Something had startled me, but I couldn't figure out what. I listened, holding my breath. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then I heard it, a faint crunch, like footsteps on dried leaves. My first thought was a deer or a bear, but the steps were too deliberate, too evenly spaced. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, clutching the knife I always kept nearby. The sound passed, fading into the distance, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I wanted to finish the loop and get back to the trailhead as soon as possible. The trail was even harder to follow now, and I spent hours bushwhacking through thick undergrowth. That's when I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. A torn backpack, its straps frayed and its contents scattered. There was no sign of the owner. The gear looked old, weathered by the elements, but I couldn't tell how long it had been there. I scanned the area for any other signs. Footprints, clothing, anything, but found nothing. My mind raced with possibilities. An accident, an animal attack, or something worse. Pushed on, my nerves frayed. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees taller and denser. I felt like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every shadow in the corner of my eye made me jump. By late afternoon, I realized I was lost. The trail had completely disappeared, and my attempts to backtrack only led me deeper into unfamiliar terrain. My map was useless without recognizable landmarks, and my compass might as well have been a toy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I came across another unsettling sight. A second pile of stones, identical to the first. This one had a weathered boot placed on top, its sole almost completely detached. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by a small fire, clutching my knife and flashlight, every sound setting my heart racing. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the firelight, but when I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to follow a small creek I'd found, hoping it would lead to a larger stream or a road. The day dragged on, my legs burning with every step. The creek eventually opened into a narrow valley, where I spotted something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A weathered cabin. It was small, with a sagging roof and walls covered in moss. I hesitated, unsure if I should approach, but the thought of shelter and the possibility of help pushed me forward. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was empty except for a rusted wood stove and a few broken chairs. The floor was littered with leaves and debris. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years, but it felt off. I decided not to stay long. As I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into the wall near the door. A series of lines and symbols I didn't recognize. They looked like some kind of tally marks, but I couldn't make sense of them. The sight unsettled me, and I left quickly. The rest of the day was a blur. I followed the creek until it led to a dirt road. Relief washed over me as I spotted tire tracks. I followed them for what felt like hours until I finally saw a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. An older man answered the door. He seemed surprised to see me but offered me water and let me use his phone to call for help. I didn't tell him everything I'd seen. I just said I'd gotten lost. When a ranger arrived to take me back to my car, I mentioned the torn backpack and the cabin. He nodded grimly and said, "That area's got a history. People go missing up there sometimes. Best to stay away." As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the piles of stones, the symbols, and the eerie silence. I still don't know what I stumbled into out there, but I know one thing: I won't be going back. Hiking has always been my escape from the noise of daily life. Being surrounded by trees, feeling the crunch of dirt under my boots, and the fresh smell of pine in the air, it grounds me. I planned this particular trip months in advance, marking a long weekend on my calendar to tackle the Ridge Trail, a challenging 20-mile loop in a remote part of the mountains. This trail wasn't for casual hikers. It was steep, rocky, and isolated, but that's exactly what I wanted. A challenge, a chance to test myself. I arrived at the trailhead early, the morning sun just beginning to filter through the trees. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that nips at your cheeks but feels invigorating. My backpack was heavy with gear, water, snacks, a sleeping bag, a small tent, a map, and a compass. I double-checked everything before starting, an old habit from years of hiking solo. The first few miles were uneventful, a steady climb through dense forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. I welcomed the shade. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding its way up the mountain. Every so often, I'd stop to catch my breath and take in the view, which grew more spectacular with each step. By midday, I reached a small clearing where I decided to have lunch. I sat on a flat rock, pulling out a sandwich and a bottle of water. The silence was profound. No hum of traffic, no chatter of people. Just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. I felt at peace. The trail became steeper after lunch, the kind of climb that forces you to plant your hands on your knees and push yourself upward. I was sweating despite the cool air, my legs burning with each step. The forest thinned as I climbed higher, the trees giving way to shrubs and jagged rocks. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge that gave the trail its name. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched out as far as I could see, a patchwork of green and brown under a sky that seemed impossibly vast. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind cool my sweat-soaked skin. This was why I hiked. Moments like this made the effort worth it. The plan was to camp at a designated site about a mile down the ridge. I checked my map to confirm the location and started walking. The trail here was narrow with steep drop-offs on either side. I had to focus on every step, my boots gripping the loose gravel. That's when I noticed something odd. A shoe. It was lying just off the trail, a single mud-streaked hiking boot. It looked relatively new, not something that had been there for months. My first thought was that someone had lost it, but how does a person lose just one boot in the middle of nowhere? I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The sole was worn, and the laces were frayed. A size tag inside told me it belonged to someone with much larger feet than mine. I set it back down, feeling a slight unease but brushing it off. People lost things all the time, right? Maybe the owner was nearby. As I continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail, which had been well marked earlier, seemed harder to follow. I found myself stopping frequently to check the map, double-checking the faint blazes painted on rocks and trees. The terrain grew rougher, the ridge narrowing further until it felt like I was walking a tightrope. Then I saw the campsite, or what I thought was the campsite. A small clearing opened up to my left, but it didn't look like the official site marked on my map. There were no signs, no fire pit, just a flat patch of ground surrounded by trees. I hesitated, unsure if I should keep going or set up camp here. The sun was dipping lower, and the shadows were growing long. I decided to stay. I pitched my tent quickly, the act of setting up camp calming my nerves. Once the tent was up and my sleeping bag unrolled, I started a small fire using the dry branches I'd collected along the trail. The warmth was comforting, and the flames cast flickering light on the surrounding trees. As I sat by the fire, eating a dehydrated meal, I heard it. A snap, the sound of a branch breaking. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Came from the trees behind me, the direction I just hiked from. I listened, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the unease I'd felt earlier returned, stronger this time. I decided to stay alert, keeping my flashlight and knife within arm's reach as I settled into the tent. Sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig jolted me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, crunching on the gravel. I held my breath, clutching the knife, but the sound faded. When dawn finally broke, I packed up quickly, eager to get off the ridge. The trail was harder to follow than I remembered, the markers faded or missing altogether. I kept the map in one hand and my compass in the other, checking them constantly. About an hour into the hike, I found something else, a backpack. It was lying in the middle of the trail, partially unzipped. Inside, I could see clothes, a water bottle, and a small first aid kit. No wallet, no ID. Just like the boot, it looked like it had been there recently. This time, I couldn't shake the fear. Someone had been here and not long ago. But where were they? And why would they leave their gear behind? I picked up my pace, practically jogging down the trail. The ridge eventually gave way to forest, the dense trees closing in around me. The air felt heavier here, the silence oppressive. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The trail eventually intersected with a dirt road, and I nearly cried with relief. I followed it to the parking lot where I'd left my car, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I never found out who left the boot or the backpack, and I didn't want to. All I know is that something or someone was out there on the ridge trail, and I'm not sure I was supposed to see it. I never considered myself an adventurous person. Sure, I loved a good walk in the woods now and then, but I wasn't the kind to push boundaries or chase thrills. That all changed one weekend when I decided to challenge myself and hike a new trail. Something more remote and rugged than the local parks I was used to. I found an online forum where seasoned hikers shared lesser-known paths, and one in particular caught my eye, the Whispering Pines Loop. It sounded poetic and inviting. The description warned that it wasn't well-marked and required a map, compass, and some experience. I ignored that part. Armed with my phone's GPS and what I thought was a decent sense of direction, I packed my bag. Snacks, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a lightweight jacket. I figured I'd be out and back within a few hours. The drive out to the trailhead took me far from the city, deeper into the countryside, where rolling hills gave way to dense forests. The narrow road twisted and turned, bordered by towering pines and the occasional warning sign about wildlife. By the time I reached the parking area, a dirt pull-off with space for maybe 3 cars, I was the only vehicle there. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that hinted at the changing seasons but wasn't uncomfortable yet. I checked my bag one last time, locked my car, and headed into the trees. The trail started easily enough. A soft bed of pine needles cushioned my steps, and the smell of the forest was rich and earthy. Every so often, I passed faded blazes on the trees, assuring me I was on the right path. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No more distant hum of traffic, no voices, no birdsong. Just the occasional rustle of leaves and the crunch of twigs beneath my boots. After about an hour, I reached what I assumed was the halfway point. A small clearing with a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched as far as I could see, their colors shifting between greens and browns under the soft light of the late afternoon. I sat down to rest and pulled out a granola bar. That's when I noticed how quickly the light was changing. The sun hung lower than I expected, casting long shadows across the landscape. I checked my phone for the time and realized I'd underestimated how long the hike would take. Worse, there was no signal to check my location or retrace my steps. I packed up quickly and started back, but something felt off. The trail seemed unfamiliar. The trees looked different, the blazes more faded, and the ground less trodden. I tried to convince myself I just missed a turn and kept walking. When I reached a fork in the path I didn't remember, panic started to creep in. I pulled out my phone, but the GPS refused to load. The compass app spun aimlessly, unable to find its bearings. I had a paper map in my bag, but no idea where I was on it. My heart raced as the realization hit me. I was lost. Determined not to waste daylight, I picked the path that seemed most traveled, hoping it would lead me back to the parking area. The trail climbed steeply, my legs burning with every step, but there was no clearing, no end in sight, just endless trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. I pulled on my jacket and switched on my flashlight. Its weak beam barely cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows that made every tree look like a figure looming just out of reach. I pressed on, hoping for any sign of civilization. A road, a cabin, even a campsite, but found nothing. My water was running low, and my stomach growled, but fear overshadowed hunger. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. Was it the wind? An animal? Someone else? By midnight, I knew I couldn't keep moving without rest. I found a spot between 2 large rocks that offered some shelter from the wind and huddled there, shivering. Sleep was impossible. My mind replayed every decision that had brought me here, each misstep that had led me deeper into the woods. The night dragged on, and by morning, I felt more exhausted than before. I forced myself to eat a few bites of an energy bar and took small sips of water, knowing I needed to conserve what little I had left. As I stood to leave, I noticed something in the dirt nearby: tracks. They were too large to be a deer's and too defined to be a bear's. My stomach churned as I realized they were boot prints. Someone else had been here, maybe recently. I followed the prints, desperate for any sign of another person. They led me downhill, through dense underbrush that tore at my clothes and scratched my skin. After what felt like hours, I emerged into a clearing and froze. The prints ended abruptly, as if the person had vanished. There was no sign of a camp or a trail, just an expanse of grass surrounded by forest. I felt a cold wave of dread. What if they'd been lost too? Shaking the thought from my head, I pressed on, choosing a direction at random. My legs ached, my throat was parched, and every step felt heavier than the last. Around midday, I stumbled onto something unexpected: a rusted metal sign, barely legible under decades of grime. It marked the boundary of a state park. Relief flooded through me. If I was near the park's edge, I had to be close to a road. With renewed energy, I followed the boundary line, ignoring the protests of my body. The terrain was rough, but the sight of the occasional park marker kept me going. By late afternoon, I heard the faint sound of rushing water. The river was wide and fast-moving, but I knew it had to lead somewhere, maybe to a bridge or a town. I walked alongside it for hours, slipping on rocks and scrambling over fallen trees, until finally, I saw it: a bridge in the distance. Reaching the road felt like waking from a nightmare. My legs buckled beneath me as I collapsed onto the pavement, waving weakly at the first car that passed. The driver, a kind older man, gave me water and called for help. As I sat in his truck, wrapped in a blanket and sipping from a bottle, the reality of what I'd been through hit me. I'd survived, but just barely. The forest had tested me in ways I never imagined, and though I made it out, I knew I'd never look at hiking the same way again. I had planned this trip for months. A solo hike through the Ridge Trail, a path known for its challenging terrain and breathtaking views. The trail was deep in the heart of the wilderness, about 5 hours from my home. The idea was to push myself, physically and mentally, while disconnecting from the noise of everyday life. I packed everything carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, map, compass, first aid kit, and my trusted hiking boots. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. As I parked my car and adjusted my backpack, I felt a sense of excitement and nervousness. I had done solo hikes before, but this one felt different. The trail was long, remote, and less traveled, which was part of the appeal. The first few hours were straightforward. The trail was well marked, and the weather was perfect: clear skies, mild temperatures, and a light breeze. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I stopped occasionally to take photos of wildflowers and the dense canopy above. By midday, I reached a small clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. I sat on a rock, had a quick lunch, and refilled my water bottle from a nearby stream using my filter. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. As the afternoon wore on, the trail became steeper and more rugged. The trees grew denser, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade. I noticed fewer signs of wildlife: no birds chirping or squirrels darting around. It was just me, the crunch of my boots on the dirt, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I kept moving, determined to reach the campsite marked on my map before sunset. It was supposed to be near a small lake, a perfect spot to set up my tent and rest for the night. But as the hours passed, I began to feel uneasy. The trail markers became harder to spot. Some were faded, while others seemed missing entirely. I checked my map repeatedly, trying to make sense of the landmarks around me. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows that made the forest seem even darker. By the time I realized I was off course, it was too late. The trail I was on had narrowed to the point where it barely existed, overgrown with shrubs and fallen branches. I had no choice but to backtrack, but the fading light made it difficult to navigate. I decided to set up camp where I was. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't want to risk wandering in the dark. I cleared a small patch of ground, pitched my tent, and made a quick dinner. The silence was unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to every sound outside. The occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made my heart race. I reminded myself that I was in the wilderness, and these noises were normal. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of something outside my tent. It was faint, like the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. I strained to listen, but the sound had stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my knife and flashlight. When dawn finally broke, I packed up quickly and set off in what I hoped was the right direction. My goal was to find the main trail again, but the forest seemed determined to keep me lost. Hours passed, and I grew more exhausted. My water supply was running low, and I hadn't seen a stream since the day before. The terrain became more difficult, with steep inclines and rocky outcrops. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep moving. Then, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A pile of rocks, stacked deliberately in the middle of the trail. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakably man-made. I hadn't seen any other hikers, and this area was far off the main path. Who had made it and why? I kept going, but the sense of unease grew stronger. I began noticing other oddities. Branches broken in unnatural patterns, faint trails that seemed to lead nowhere, and the occasional faint whiff of smoke. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired and paranoid. By late afternoon, I came across an abandoned campsite. The remains of a fire pit, a torn tarp hanging from a tree, and a rusted tin can scattered on the ground. It looked like no one had been there for years. I searched the area for anything useful but found nothing. I decided to move on, not wanting to linger in such an eerie place. As the sun began to set, I realized I would have to camp again. I chose a spot on higher ground, hoping it would be safer. That night was worse than the last. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. When morning came, I felt more exhausted than ever. Desperation set in. I needed to find water and the main trail. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the aches in my body and the gnawing hunger in my stomach. Then I saw it, a faint trail marker, barely visible on a tree trunk. Relief washed over me as I realized I was back on the main path. But the relief was short-lived. A few hundred feet down the trail, I found a backpack. It was weathered and partially covered in dirt, but it looked like it hadn't been there long. Inside, I found a water bottle, a map, and a flashlight. No identification, no sign of the owner. I took the water and the map, grateful for anything that could help me. The map showed a different route than the one I had planned, one that led to a ranger station a few miles away. It was risky, but I decided to take it. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, but the forest was empty. Still, I quickened my pace, determined to reach the ranger station before dark. When I finally saw the small building through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I ran the last few steps, banging on the door until a ranger opened it. I told him everything, the missing trail markers, the abandoned campsite, the backpack. He listened carefully, then told me I was lucky. That part of the forest was rarely traveled, and several hikers had gone missing there over the years. I left the forest that day, vowing never to hike alone again. The wilderness had tested me in ways I never expected, and while I survived, I knew I wouldn't forget the experience anytime soon. The Ridge Trail had taught me a lesson. Nature is beautiful but unforgiving, and preparation is no substitute for respect. I had always loved hiking. There was something about the quiet stillness of the wilderness, broken only by the sound of rustling leaves or the occasional bird call, that calmed me. For years, I had explored trails across the country, seeking out places where I could feel truly alone with nature. This time, I had my eyes set on the Ridge Trail, a remote path winding through the mountains. It was known for its rugged terrain, breathtaking views, and, as I would later learn, its unpredictability. I set out early on a crisp September morning. The trailhead was an hour's drive from the nearest town, and by the time I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. I parked my car, shouldered my pack, and began my ascent. The plan was straightforward: hike up to the ridge, camp overnight, and descend the following day. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was well marked, winding through dense forests of pine and spruce. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground in patches of gold. I stopped occasionally to take in the scenery or drink from my water bottle, but for the most part, I kept moving. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. As I climbed higher, the trail grew steeper and rockier. The trees thinned out, giving way to scrubby bushes and patches of bare rock. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the sharp tang of mountain air. I paused to catch my breath and looked back. The view was incredible. Rolling hills stretched out as far as the eye could see, their green and gold hues softened by the morning mist. Around midday, I reached a flat stretch of trail that hugged the side of the mountain. To my left, the slope dropped away sharply, offering uninterrupted views of the valley below. To my right, the mountainside rose steeply, its surface dotted with boulders and tufts of grass. I stopped to eat a quick lunch, a granola bar and some trail mix before pressing on. The further I went, the more remote the trail became. The well-worn path gave way to a narrow track barely visible beneath the undergrowth. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree blocking the trail, its bark rough beneath my hands. The solitude, which I had found so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge. The trail leveled out, and I found myself walking along a narrow spine of rock with steep drop-offs on either side. The views were breathtaking. To the east, the mountains stretched into the distance, their peaks tinged with the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. To the west, the valley lay in shadow, the dense forest below looking dark and impenetrable. I set up camp on a small, flat patch of ground just off the trail. The wind was stronger up here, and I had to weigh down the corners of my tent with rocks to keep it from blowing away. After securing my gear, I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, instant noodles and a cup of tea. As I ate, I watched the sun dip below the horizon, its final rays casting the mountains in a fiery glow. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped up my tent, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls of my tent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still, listening intently. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving outside my tent. I told myself it was probably just the wind or a small animal, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right outside. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. I thought about unzipping the tent to take a look, but the thought of what I might see kept me frozen in place. Eventually, the sound stopped. I lay awake for hours, every nerve on edge, until exhaustion finally overtook me. When I woke the next morning, the first thing I did was check outside. Nothing seemed out of place. My gear was untouched, and there were no signs of wildlife. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I packed up quickly and began my descent. The trail seemed different in the morning light, narrower, more treacherous. I moved carefully, my eyes scanning the path ahead for any sign of danger. About an hour into my hike, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. A set of footprints, fresh and distinct, crossed the trail in front of me. They weren't mine. I had come up this way the day before, and these prints were headed in the opposite direction. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail since I started. The parking lot had been nearly empty, and this section of the ridge trail was too remote for casual hikers. I pressed on, my senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my heart racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The descent was grueling. Loose rocks and steep slopes made every step a challenge. My legs burned, and my feet ached, but I didn't dare stop. The sense of unease that had started the night before had grown into full-blown fear. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted but relieved. My car was right where I had left it, the sight of it a welcome reminder of civilization. I threw my pack in the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The ridge trail disappeared behind me, swallowed by the forest. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after I left the mountains. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked my gear that I noticed something strange. One of the pockets on my backpack was unzipped, and the contents, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a packet of trail mix, were missing. I knew I hadn't left it open. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the ridge trail. The footprints, the sounds outside my tent, the missing items. All of it pointed to one chilling conclusion. Someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting. I haven't been back to the ridge trail since. It was a brisk autumn morning when I set out for my hike. The leaves were just starting to change, painting the landscape with fiery reds and oranges. I had planned this trip for weeks, eagerly checking weather forecasts and poring over trail maps. The route was ambitious, a loop through a less traveled section of the mountains with steep climbs and remote paths. It was supposed to take 3 days, and I was carrying everything I needed: a tent, food, water, and enough gear to handle unexpected weather. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. My car was the only one in the small gravel lot, which gave me an odd sense of pride. Most people stuck to the popular trails, but I craved solitude and challenge. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your fingers before the sun warms the day. I adjusted my pack, checked the straps, and started walking. The first few miles were uneventful, just the rhythmic crunch of boots on dirt and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. The forest was dense, with towering pines and the occasional gap where sunlight spilled through. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding up gentle inclines and across small streams. I felt alive, every step pulling me further from the noise of daily life and deeper into the wilderness. By midday, I reached the first significant climb. The trail snaked up the side of a steep hill, with loose rocks making the footing tricky. I stopped for a quick break, leaning against a boulder and sipping water while taking in the view. Below me, the forest stretched endlessly, a patchwork of green and gold. Above, the sky was a cloudless blue, and the air smelled clean and sharp. The climb was tougher than I'd expected. My pack felt heavier with each step, and sweat dripped down my back despite the cool air. I focused on my breathing, steady and controlled, counting my steps to keep a rhythm. When I finally reached the top, I was rewarded with a breathtaking view. Rolling hills fading into the horizon, their peaks dusted with the season's first snow. I set up camp that night near a small clearing, close to a bubbling creek. The sound of the water was soothing, and I felt a deep sense of peace as I pitched my tent and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature plummeted. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and watched the stars appear, bright and sharp against the inky sky. The second day started early. I woke to frost on my tent and the distant call of a lone bird. After a quick breakfast, I packed up and hit the trail, eager to cover more ground. This section was even more remote, with narrow paths that twisted through thick underbrush. The trees seemed older here, their gnarled branches reaching like arms, and the ground was littered with fallen leaves that muffled my steps. By midday, I noticed something odd. The trail markers, usually painted blazes on trees or small cairns of stacked stones, became less frequent. At first, I shrugged it off, assuming I'd simply missed a few in my focus on the terrain. But as the hours passed, I realized I hadn't seen a marker in a while. I stopped to check my map. The trail should have been straightforward, a single path looping around a ridge before descending to a valley. But the map didn't match the landscape around me. There was no ridge in sight, only dense forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I retraced my steps, scanning every tree for a blaze, every rock for a marker. Nothing. The trail seemed to vanish, swallowed by the wilderness. I tried to stay calm. I had a compass and a general sense of direction. If I headed west, I'd eventually hit the valley where the trail looped back. I adjusted my pack and started walking, pushing through the underbrush. The going was slow, each step a fight against tangled roots and thorny branches. Hours passed. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even more claustrophobic. My unease grew into a gnawing fear. I was lost, deep in the wilderness, with no clear way back. As the light faded, I knew I had to stop. Wandering in the dark was too dangerous. I found a small, relatively flat spot and set up my tent, though my hands trembled as I worked. Dinner was a rushed affair, and I ate without appetite, my thoughts racing. The night was long and restless. Every sound, a rustling leaf, a snapping twig, sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just the wind, small animals, nothing to fear. But the feeling of being utterly alone, miles from any help, was suffocating. Morning brought little relief. The forest looked the same in every direction, an endless maze of trees and shadows. I tried to follow the compass again, keeping my pace steady, but the terrain grew more challenging. The ground was uneven, with hidden holes that threatened to twist an ankle. Streams crisscrossed the area, forcing me to backtrack or wade through icy water. By the third day, my food supplies were dwindling, and my energy was sapped. My legs ached, and my throat was raw from yelling for help. The rational part of me knew it was unlikely anyone would hear. This area was too remote, too isolated. I stumbled upon a small clearing around midday. In the center stood a dilapidated structure, barely more than a few rotting wooden beams leaning against each other. It looked like an old hunting blind or the remnants of a forgotten shelter. My initial relief at finding something man-made quickly turned to dread as I inspected it. The wood was blackened in places, as if scorched by fire, and the ground around it was littered with bones. Animal bones, I told myself, though I didn't look closely enough to be sure. I didn't linger. The sight of the structure filled me with an overwhelming urge to leave, to put as much distance between myself and it as possible. The next hours blurred together. I pushed forward blindly, my focus narrowed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. When I finally broke through the trees and onto a gravel road, the relief was so intense I nearly collapsed. A car came by not long after, its driver a kind older man who didn't ask too many questions. He drove me to the nearest town, where I called for help and arranged a ride back to my car. The experience stayed with me long after I returned home. I couldn't shake the memory of that structure, those bones, the sense of something watching me in the forest. I still hike, but I stick to well-traveled trails now with clear markers and other people nearby. Getting lost out there taught me a harsh lesson. Nature doesn't care about you. It's vast, indifferent, and unforgiving. All it takes is one wrong turn to find yourself at its mercy. I never considered myself an expert hiker, but I wasn't a beginner either. I had a decent understanding of trails, weather patterns, and survival basics. That's why, when I decided to spend a weekend hiking in a remote area near the Appalachians, I didn't overthink it. It was meant to be a solo trip, a way to clear my mind from work stress and the noise of everyday life. The location was a place I'd found online. A quiet gorge with a network of trails that wound through dense forest, rocky outcroppings, and, eventually, a high plateau with sweeping views. Sounded perfect. I planned everything meticulously. I packed a small tent, enough food for 3 days, a lightweight sleeping bag, and extra layers in case the weather turned. I also had my GPS, a map, and a first aid kit. My pack wasn't light, but it wasn't overwhelming either. I felt confident as I started out early on a Friday morning. The first day went smoothly. The trailhead was quiet, and I only saw a couple of other hikers heading in the opposite direction. The forest was dense, the air cool and crisp. It was the kind of solitude I'd been craving. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite, a small clearing near a stream. I set up my tent, cooked some dehydrated meals, and spent the evening listening to the gentle trickle of water and the occasional rustle of leaves. The second day started off just as peaceful. I broke camp early and began the climb toward the plateau. The trail was steeper here, with sections of loose rock and switchbacks that made me pause to catch my breath. By midday, I reached the top, and the view was everything I'd hoped for. The landscape stretched endlessly, with rolling hills and patches of mist clinging to the valleys below. I sat there for nearly an hour, eating lunch and letting the vastness of the view put my worries into perspective. But as I started to descend, things began to change. The trail wasn't as well marked as I'd expected. I'd noticed this on the way up, but hadn't thought much of it. On the way down, however, I missed a marker entirely. I didn't realize it until I was deep into a different part of the forest, where the trees were closer together and the undergrowth thicker. My GPS wasn't helping much. The dense canopy seemed to interfere with the signal, and my position kept jumping around. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest looked different in every direction. I told myself to stay calm. I had plenty of daylight left, and the stream I'd camped by the night before was downhill somewhere. If I found it, I could follow it back to familiar ground. Hours passed. The forest became denser, and the ground steeper. I slipped several times on damp leaves and loose dirt, my knees and hands taking the brunt of the falls. By late afternoon, I knew I was completely off track. The stream I'd hoped to find never appeared, and the landscape kept shifting. Steeper ridges, deeper ravines, and patches of thick brambles that tore at my clothes and skin. When night fell, I had no choice but to stop. I found a relatively flat area under a large tree, cleared away the debris, and set up my tent. My nerves were starting to fray. Every sound in the forest felt amplified. The snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I didn't sleep much that night, and when I did, It was fitful and filled with uneasy dreams. The next morning, I was determined to find my way out. I studied my map carefully, comparing it with what little signal I could get on my GPS based on my best guess. I needed to head northeast to intersect with another trail that looped back toward the trailhead. It seemed straightforward enough, but the terrain didn't cooperate. I found myself in a steep ravine by midday, the sides too slippery to climb and the bottom littered with fallen trees. I had to pick my way through slowly, often on my hands and knees, to avoid twisting an ankle or worse. The weight of my pack was starting to wear on me, and my legs felt like lead. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and no closer to finding a trail. That night was worse than the first. I could hear the howls of coyotes in the distance, and at one point, I was sure something larger was moving around near my campsite. I clutched my pocket knife tightly, knowing it wasn't much of a defense but feeling slightly safer with it in hand. The noises eventually faded, but the tension didn't. I barely slept. On the third day, I made a critical mistake. I was desperate to find water. My supply was dangerously low, and the small streams I came across were too shallow to refill my bottle. When I heard the faint sound of running water, I veered off my planned direction to follow it. The stream was there, but it led me deeper into the gorge, where the walls were higher and the paths narrower. I realized too late that I'd trapped myself in a section of the forest that was almost impossible to navigate. Climbing out took hours and drained what little energy I had left. When I finally reached the top of the ridge, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. My hands were scraped raw, my knees bruised and swollen. I ate the last of my food and stared at the horizon, hoping to spot something, anything, that looked familiar. There was nothing but endless trees. By the fourth day, my situation was dire. I was out of food, nearly out of water, and physically spent. The thought of staying in one place crossed my mind, but the idea of waiting for help that might never come was unbearable. I forced myself to keep moving, though every step felt like a monumental effort. Late in the afternoon, I stumbled across an old logging road. It was overgrown and barely recognizable, but it was a sign of civilization. I followed it for hours, my legs moving on autopilot, until I saw the faint glimmer of headlights through the trees. A truck was coming toward me, its driver staring in disbelief as I waved my arms and called out. The man was a local hunter who knew the area well. He gave me water and a ride back to a nearby town, where I collapsed into a chair at the ranger station and recounted my ordeal. They told me I was lucky to be alive. Many hikers who got lost in that area didn't make it out. As I sat there, sipping a cup of hot coffee and letting the reality of my escape sink in, I realized how close I'd come to becoming another statistic. The experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. I haven't been hiking alone since, and I doubt I ever will again. The forest, for all its beauty, is an unforgiving place when you're not prepared for its challenges. I decided to take a solo hike in the mountains near where I lived. It was early October, and the leaves had turned to brilliant shades of orange, red, and gold. The crisp air was perfect for a long hike, and I had been itching for some solitude. I was drawn to a lesser-known trail I'd heard about from a coworker, a path she described as peaceful but challenging. It wasn't in any guidebooks, and the entrance was marked only by a small wooden sign that read, Hollow Ridge Trail. I packed my day pack carefully: water, snacks, a basic first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone. I also had a map of the area, though I knew the trail itself wasn't on it. I felt confident. I'd hiked alone before and knew how to stay safe. The drive to the trailhead was long and winding, with barely a car in sight. By the time I parked, the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, bathing the forest in soft, golden light. I locked my car, shouldered my pack, and set off down the trail. The first couple of hours were everything I hoped for. The trail was quiet, with no signs of other hikers. I could hear birds chirping and the faint rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The air smelled earthy, a mix of fallen leaves and damp soil. I took my time, stopping occasionally to admire the views of distant peaks or the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. As I climbed higher, the trail grew steeper and more rugged. Loose rocks and exposed roots demanded my full attention. My boots were sturdy, but even so, I stumbled a few times, catching myself on nearby branches. It was a good reminder to stay focused. Around midday, I stopped for a break on a flat, rocky outcrop with a stunning view of the valley below. I ate a granola bar, drank some water, and checked my phone. No signal, which didn't surprise me. I had expected to lose service once I got deep into the mountains. I reassured myself that I had everything I needed to navigate back. After resting, I continued upward. The trail narrowed and became less defined. I noticed fewer markers, and the path itself was overgrown in places. Still, I pressed on, confident that I could retrace my steps if needed. About an hour later, I reached a fork in the trail. There was no sign to indicate which direction led where, and both paths looked equally worn. I hesitated, debating whether to turn back or take a chance. I opted for the left path, reasoning that it seemed to slope upward, which matched the general direction I had been heading. The further I walked, the more the trail seemed to vanish. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler here, and the forest was eerily silent. I kept looking for markers or any signs that I was on the right path, but there were none. Eventually, I realized I wasn't on a trail at all. I stopped, trying to quell the rising panic in my chest. I took a deep breath and turned around, determined to retrace my steps. But as I walked, nothing looked familiar. The landscape seemed different, as if the forest itself had shifted. I checked my watch. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. I knew I had only a couple of hours of daylight left. I pulled out my map, but it was useless. Without knowing my exact location, it was impossible to figure out which direction to go. I decided to rely on my instincts and headed downhill, reasoning that I'd eventually reach the valley where I had started. But the descent was treacherous. The ground was uneven, covered in loose rocks and patches of moss that made every step precarious. More than once, I slipped and had to catch myself on a tree or rock. As the light faded, I realized I would need to find a place to wait out the night. The thought of spending the night alone in the forest was terrifying, but stumbling around in the dark was even more dangerous. I found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees that offered some protection from the wind. I used my flashlight to gather dry leaves and branches to make a rudimentary shelter. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I sat with my back against a tree, my flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. The battery was low, but I kept it off to conserve power. The forest at night was alive with sounds, branches creaking, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant howl of an animal. Every noise made my heart race, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't sleep much that night. My body ached from the hike, and the cold seeped into my bones despite my layers. When dawn finally broke, I felt a surge of relief. The sunlight brought a sense of safety, even if I was still lost. I resumed my descent, sticking to the same direction. The terrain became increasingly difficult, with steep slopes and thick underbrush. At one point, I came across a stream and decided to follow it, reasoning that it might lead to a larger water source or even civilization. Hours passed, and my legs felt like lead. My water supply was running low, and I was down to my last granola bar. The stream twisted and turned, sometimes forcing me to climb over rocks or wade through shallow pools. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard the faint hum of a motor. My heart leapt. I pushed through the underbrush, my muscles screaming in protest, and emerged onto a dirt road. I collapsed to my knees, overwhelmed with relief. Moments later, a pickup truck came into view. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, stopped and rolled down his window. He looked as shocked to see me as I was to see him. He asked if I was okay and offered to drive me to the nearest town. I climbed into the truck, grateful beyond words. As we drove, I explained what had happened. He nodded, saying I was lucky to have found the road. By the time I reached town, I was exhausted but safe. I called a friend to pick me up and made a mental note to never underestimate the wilderness again. The experience left me shaken but also more cautious. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also unforgiving. Looking back, I realized how easily things could have ended differently. The hike had taught me a valuable lesson about preparation and respect for nature. It wasn't the adventure I had planned, but it was one I'd never forget. It was supposed to be just another hike. I had done dozens before, some in Vermont, where I grew up, and others here in Switzerland, where I've been living. The trails near my town were challenging but manageable, and they offered views that made every step worth the effort. This time, though, I wanted to push myself a little further, to try a route I'd never done before, one that promised solitude and scenery in equal measure. That's how I ended up picking the Aiguille Pass hike. It wasn't marked on most tourist maps, but an experienced local hiker had mentioned it in passing, describing it as untouched and not for beginners. I thought I was ready for it. I packed my gear carefully the night before. My backpack included all the essentials: a map, compass, plenty of water, protein bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my favorite multi-tool. I even double-checked the weather forecast, which predicted clear skies. The hike was supposed to take about 8 hours round trip. Challenging, but nothing I couldn't handle. I planned to start early in the morning to leave myself plenty of daylight. I parked my car at the trailhead just as the sun was rising. The sky was painted with hues of pink and orange, and the air was crisp and cool. There was no one else around, which I found reassuring. I liked hiking alone. It gave me time to clear my head and connect with nature. I locked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started up the trail. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through dense pine forests. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds, but otherwise, it was silent. I settled into a steady rhythm, my boots crunching against the gravel path. The incline was gradual, nothing too demanding yet, and I found myself enjoying the solitude. After about an hour, I reached a clearing where the forest opened up to reveal a panoramic view of the valley below. The sight took my breath away. The town where I'd started was a mere speck in the distance, and the mountains stretched endlessly in every direction. I paused to take a sip of water and snap a few pictures on my phone before continuing. As I climbed higher, the trail grew steeper and less defined. The trees thinned out, replaced by rocky terrain and patches of snow. I kept checking my map to ensure I was on the right path. The route wasn't marked with trail signs, so I had to rely on natural landmarks and the occasional cairn left by previous hikers. It was slow going, but I felt confident. About 3 hours in, I hit my first snag. The trail forked unexpectedly, and neither option matched the description on my map. One path veered sharply to the left, descending slightly before disappearing around a bend. The other climbed steeply upward, cutting across a scree field. I hesitated, trying to make sense of my surroundings. According to the map, I should have been approaching a small alpine lake, but there was no sign of water in either direction. I decided to go left, reasoning that a descending path might lead to the lake. The terrain became more challenging, with loose rocks and patches of mud making each step uncertain. After about 15 minutes, I realized I had made a mistake. The trail petered out completely, leaving me standing in the middle of a rocky slope with no clear way forward. Frustrated, I retraced my steps to the fork and took the other path. This one was even steeper, and the loose scree made it difficult to maintain my footing. I had to use my hands to steady myself as I climbed, grabbing onto boulders and tufts of grass for support. My legs burned with the effort, and I was starting to feel the weight of my backpack. Still, I pressed on, determined to find the lake. When I finally reached the top of the scree field, I was greeted by a stunning view of the surrounding peaks. But there was no lake, just an expanse of jagged rocks and snow. I checked my watch and realized I had already been hiking for nearly 4 hours. If I didn't find the lake soon, I'd have to turn back to ensure I had enough daylight for the return trip. I decided to push on a little further. The trail, or what was left of it, wound around the side of a mountain, narrowing to a precarious ledge. Below me, the slope dropped steeply into a valley, and I could hear the faint roar of a river far below. The path was barely wide enough for 1 foot at a time, and I had to hug the rock wall to keep my balance. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to focus on each step. As I rounded a bend, the ledge widened slightly, and I spotted something up ahead, a faint trail of footprints in the snow. Relief washed over me. Someone else had been here recently, which meant I was still on the right track. Encouraged, I quickened my pace, following the footprints as they climbed higher into the mountains. But the relief was short-lived. After about 20 minutes, the footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of a steep drop-off. I stared down into the abyss, my stomach churning. The person who had left the prints must have turned back, but there was no indication of where they had gone. I looked around, trying to spot another trail, but the landscape was barren and featureless. I realized then just how alone I was. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the rocks. My phone had no signal, and the battery was already half drained from taking pictures earlier. I felt a flicker of panic but pushed it down. Panicking wouldn't help me now. I needed to stay calm and figure out a plan. I decided to backtrack to the last clear marker I had passed. The climb down the ledge was even more nerve-wracking than the ascent, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. By the time I reached the scree field, my legs were trembling with exhaustion. I checked my watch again and saw that it was already past noon. If I didn't start heading back soon, I'd risk being caught in the dark. But as I scanned the landscape, I realized with growing dread that I wasn't sure which way to go. The rocky terrain all looked the same, and without a clear trail to follow, I felt disoriented. My map was no help. It showed the general area but lacked the detailed topography I needed to navigate this kind of terrain. I tried to retrace my steps, but every path I chose seemed to lead me in circles. The hours dragged on and my frustration grew. I cursed myself for not bringing a GPS device or a more detailed map. I had always prided myself on my sense of direction, but now it felt like the mountains were conspiring against me, leading me deeper into their maze. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. I knew I had to find shelter before nightfall. I spotted a cluster of large boulders near the base of a ridge and decided to make camp there. It wasn't ideal, exposed and cold, but it was better than wandering aimlessly in the dark. I used my multi-tool to gather some dry branches and managed to start a small fire. The warmth was a welcome comfort, but it did little to ease the gnawing anxiety in my gut. I rationed my water and ate a protein bar, trying to conserve my supplies. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. I wrapped myself in my jacket and huddled close to the fire, listening to the eerie sounds of the wilderness. The occasional crack of rocks shifting in the cold made me jump, and I kept imagining shapes moving in the shadows. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night staring into the flames, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, I extinguished the fire and set off again, determined to find my way back. I tried to stay positive, telling myself that as long as I kept moving, I'd eventually find a familiar landmark. But the more I walked, the more I felt like I was wandering in circles. Every ridge I climbed revealed another endless expanse of rock and snow. My water supply was dwindling, and my legs ached with every step. By midday, I was starting to lose hope. The mountains seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I knew it was irrational, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the sense of unease was overwhelming. I forced myself to keep going, one foot in front of the other. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, I spotted something in the distance, a faint trail of smoke rising above the trees. My heart leapt with hope. Smoke meant people, and people meant help. I stumbled toward it, my exhaustion forgotten. As I got closer, I saw the outline of a small cabin nestled in the trees. When I reached the cabin, I pounded on the door, half expecting it to be abandoned. To my relief, an elderly man opened it, his face lined with years of weather and work. He didn't speak much English, but he understood enough to offer me water and a place to rest. I spent the night there, grateful beyond words for his kindness. The next day, he led me down a narrow, hidden trail that eventually brought me back to the main road. I was exhausted, filthy, and starving, but I was alive. As I drove back to my town, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing myself in those mountains. It was a harsh reminder of the power of nature and the importance of respecting it. I haven't attempted a hike like that since.